Hello and welcome to this video on Godzilla and how, for all the positive depictions in the most recent films, it is likely that they present a threat to any life in even remote proximity. Godzilla is shown occurring several ways, from a natural giant creature formed in the prehistoric to a lizard mutated into a monstrous being through radiation. The most consistent origin seems to be a prehistoric creature given greater power through nuclear radiation exposure, generally speaking atomic bomb testing in the 50s and 60s. Godzilla's character design is that of a large amphibious reptilian monster, generally shaped after a dinosaur. Unlike most dinosaurs, it is an erect creature that has a very scaly skin and a somewhat anthropomorphic torso with muscular arms, basically very similar to a human body. There are also a number of bony plates along its back and tail, and a very large furrowed brow. The original 1954 Godzilla was scaled to be 50 meters in size. Later Godzilla models were estimated to be somewhere around 122 meters high. The maximum depicted height has been about 300 meters, although this is a significant outlier, with most hovering around the 120 meter mark. The supplementary information has shown Godzilla weighing between 20,000 and 60,000 metric tons, between 22 and 66 short tons or imperial tons for American Freedom Unit users. Godzilla is amphibious and appears to prefer traveling through the Earth's hydrosphere, or basically through the oceans. It can also breathe underwater. It is apparently a transitional creature somewhere between a marine and terrestrial reptile. It is incredibly resilient to any kind of damage and immune to just about all weapons, barring the atomic kind. Some incarnations are shown to be able to generate a sort of EMP effect, although this is really a limited example. Godzilla is most certainly fertile, as they appear to have a number of offspring, including Manila and Godzilla Jr. Godzilla does have a range of abilities, and other than the EMP, these include an atomic heat beam, a diacetylic roar, and a very strong degree of regeneration. This background is important to look at whether or not Godzilla is safe. Not because it is a giant lizard, but because it is a walking radiation exposure risk. To put this in context, Godzilla can produce the previously mentioned atomic heat beam. This is an ability that produces roughly 3.15 by 10 to the 14th power of joules, or roughly that in equivalent power. This is equivalent to a W-76, an American nuclear warhead intended to be launched from ballistic missile submarines. While they are considered low-yield warheads, they are a nuclear warhead nonetheless. The caveat is that where a nuclear submarine may be able to launch several of these, Godzilla can fire off one beam on a regular basis, and consistently so. There is no need to make a new Godzilla or recharge to much of an extent, the same way a nuclear submarine would need to reload and rearm. It is a breath supposedly capable of creating 500,000 degrees Celsius heat, or roughly 900,000 degrees Fahrenheit. For now, let's ignore the issue of heat and focus solely on the atomic part of the atomic heat beam. If it is atomic, then we have a problem. To release the known amount of power in joules, we need to examine how much radiation this is going to generate, as it is unlikely to be a clean fission reaction if it is anything remotely close to that. That means fallout and radiation, but not the good kind of fallout like New Vegas. We know that 1 joule per 1 kilogram equals 100 rads or 1 gray. That is enough to start radiation poisoning calculations. Between 1 and 8 grays, you can get serious issues, with the hemopoietic system being utterly decimated. This increases infection risk and causes hemorrhage. Between 5 and 20 grays, you get gastrointestinal issues, diarrhea, loss of fluids, and bleeding in the internal systems, and ultimately perforation, causing all manner of other issues like sepsis. More than 20 grays, and we start having neurological and vascular issues, particularly purely neurovascular, so those are the arteries and vessels in the brain responsible for things like blood and oxygen supply. Headaches, neurological defects, and levels of consciousness will vary. There are roughly 3.15 by 10 to the 12th power in joules converted into rads. An average adult male is roughly 85 kilograms. This gives a whole body dose from Godzilla every time he fires an atomic heat ray of 3.71 by 10 to the 12th power of rads. Simply put, dead. And not just dead. Dead and your next 10 generations dead with you at this rate. If they were so lucky to survive the whole exposure, about 5% of that energy is in the form of gamma radiation. That means you have about 5% exposure that will just not kill and destroy anything and everything. If they survive the radiation, they will die from radiation poisoning, slowly by most standards, but in incredible agony the entire time. Of course, death by radiation is one issue. Once we explain what happens next, probably the preferable way to die. Another issue is what happens to all the water in your body. Water needs 4,200 joules to raise 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. In other words, the atomic heat beam raises the temperature in the air by 75 billion degrees Celsius. Of course, that assumes only one small immediate location. This is where we need to talk about what happens to the human body. The body is 70% water, so 85 kilograms. When you multiply this by 70%, it's roughly 60 kilograms of water. This is enough energy to boil the average male human 53 billion times over. Yes, Godzilla would literally eradicate every life on Earth about 7 times over every time he fires the atomic heat beam. Admittedly, again, this assumes every individual is exposed to it and gets the full dose, rather than as the beam travels by, but nonetheless, understand that that kind of exposure is crazy dangerous. To be able to launch this atomic heat beam, Godzilla must also be radioactive to some degree, which is a constant passive source of radiation that is likely to be relatively constant compared to the spike during other events, like firing that beam. Let's assume that Godzilla is like a nuclear reactor and able to accumulate enough power for his blast in a short time frame of roughly 30 to 60 seconds. This would explain why he can fire them off consecutively. Let's assume the longer time frame, so 60 seconds. That means Godzilla must produce roughly 5,250 gigawatts of power every second. OI, one of the biggest nuclear reactors in the world, makes approximately 0.05 gigawatts of power per second across at least 4 separate reactors. To make this power, Godzilla would need a baseline to build up from, as simply ramping up power production from nothing is very hard. Even if we assume that he is sitting on 10% of the total output needed, and the 5% gamma radiation we know is made, that means there are roughly 262,500 million joules of gamma radiation being radiated from Godzilla every second. Going back to the average male at 85 kilograms and the previously mentioned rads per kilogram dose, we get 30,882,353 rads, or just shy of 31 million rads. Godzilla would need to produce this constantly as a baseline, and drastically increase output every time he used his atomic heat beam. The largest atomic bomb ever tested by the USA, called Castle Bravo, was 9,460 rads as exposure. This means Godzilla's background radiation levels are not quite 3,300 times the biggest atomic bomb ever detonated by the USA, at an exact factor of 3.265. Even this assumes some distance, as we calculate it based on exposure to the Hiroshima bomb, and the samples with that had a distance of 1.6 kilometers or 1 mile from the epicenter of the reaction, to get something of a ratio and scale. If you were closer, you would obviously have a higher dose, and the further away you were, the lower the dose. Now for the truly morbid part of this. Do you remember how we mentioned radiation caused death, sickness, and possibly being boiled alive? That now needs to be considered again. Unfortunately, it definitely isn't better in terms of the outcome, just less magnified. There is still enough energy just from the gamma radiation being pumped out to boil alive one adult male human 735,294 times a second. Not to mention the radiation sickness that it would cause if they were so unfortunate as to survive and then die very slowly. As you can see, Godzilla is not an ecological hero or even a hazard. Godzilla is a walking apocalypse. Even without regularly using what is for all intents and purposes a global death beam, he can destroy all life within possibly tens, if not hundreds of kilometers around him. This is through radiation poisoning. It would not just be animals, plants, fungi, microorganisms. Anything living would die from what the gamma radiation would do to their genome. Godzilla is not helping. He's not even a walking atomic bomb. He is walking death. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.